Most people don't reflect on that, right? 80% of the world's biodiversity is sustained by indigenous peoples. And so given how big that is, we had another good quote from the same page. There's little acknowledgement of what happens to our indigenous leaders who advocate for land and indigenous rights in Latin America. Why is this still happening today? It's a good question. There's still an attitude in certain places that they're just doing science and they don't need to talk to anybody, for one thing. When people go into other places, they're like, oh, I'm just here to do my science and I'm gonna collect this specimen. There's also still a very embedded idea that if you're doing conservation, it means keeping the people away. And if a person shows up, they're like, oh, that's gonna wreck things. And so there's also an idea that the people that are in their environments are wrecking them, that they're a threat to their environments. In some cases, because even many indigenous peoples have adopted practices that sell market products and do things. So it's not entirely crazy, but it is something that is frustrating and needs to be adjusted. One way to not do this is to get this drum and look for the indigenous culture expert. Why?
Oh, so that's clarified. Not everyone is an expert and everyone has a different perspective. There's not just one spokesperson.
Yeah, it is true. And there's this whole idea that if you're the one person, you're going to be able to speak for everybody. What do the indigenous people think of that, and asking one person about that issue? What the heck is xenophobia? She says that this creates this domino effect where you have US xenophobia against Mexicans, but Mexicans have xenophobia against Central Americans. And they just elected a new president in Panama who says he's going to stop people from coming through Panama. Because people are making this incredible trek. They'll go through South America, up through Panama, and then they finally get to the border. And he says he's going to stop them. So that'll be something. And she says that this works even in indigenous communities. It actually can divide people. Even people who consider themselves indigenous will also have this kind of nationalistic. And she knows this because she talks to people in Mexico and El Salvador, where her father is from and her mother is more from Mexico. I just want to mention too, in this part, that there's this idea if anybody is from Latin America that they should be speaking Spanish, and so people will try to speak to them in Spanish. Actually, it occurs to me that this happens in a lot of places as well, that Americans sometimes assume that any foreign language is actually Spanish. So what she says is this idea that because people get all into, even the progressive people, don't get me wrong, people are so mad about bilingual education, but what she's saying is that even bilingual education is basically talking about two languages that for indigenous people were both colonial, English and Spanish. And so when we go into places like New Mexico and say, hey, why aren't they speaking English? Well, the people that are in New Mexico were probably often told to speak Spanish before they were told to speak English. So we have two colonizing languages. So anyway, she says that xenophobia is often left out of environmental justice discourse. And the other thing that she says is left out is gender violence. So that's something that often gets left out of the idea of environmental justice, like xenophobia. People don't recognize it. And two, like xenophobia, she says it does happen within indigenous communities as well. And it's a complicated quote because she goes back home and the men become uncomfortable with her because they're weirded out by her having a degree.
There's no equivalent because
There's no equivalent. Some people would lump them into the idea of a third gender, or some people think of this. In North America, some people call this two-spirit, people who are born with both spirit. Hernandez is talking about homophobia within indigenous communities and the need to protect them. She says that they are mostly identified during their childhood, and this is how the community has been able to protect them. I don't know. I find this interesting right now because people are way down on gender stuff during childhood. People are really mad about that. So they'd be really mad about this too. Hernandez talks about the idea of ecofeminism. What's interesting to me is she probably could have said that ecofeminism is a Western idea, because she said that conservation is a Western idea, and often people consider feminism to be a Western idea that doesn't belong in their societies. But actually, she takes an interesting perspective on this. She says that ecofeminism is an integral component of my indigeneity. And so it's interesting that she has embraced, for example, the Black people's movements as indigenous, as part of the indigenous discourse. She's embraced feminism. She's embraced some of the third gender and fighting against racism, misogyny, and xenophobia and homophobia, both in dominant society and within indigenous communities. It's an interesting perspective. It is not without controversy, and it's not always the perspective that other people take, but I find it very refreshing to think inclusively about some of these movements. Who asks questions to whom?
The oppressor asks the oppressed how they should stop, how to stop oppressing.
Yeah, what should I do? How should I solve this? How should we solve this problem? And she says, no, that's just more questions and shifts the obligation to do the hard work toward the oppressed and not the oppressor. What am I willing to do to help indigenous communities across the Americas that continue to face the eco wars? What role do I play in the xenophobia, gender rights violations, and anti-Blackness that are present through the Americas? Those are important questions. And then she says that we need folks who will be willing to give up the power and privilege that they are granted within this system based solely on their race and socioeconomic status. And that's not easy to do. I don't know if I want to do it. I don't know if I'm ready to give anything up. It's hard, right? It's not easy.